welcome to all of you on behalf of the ICC, as we refer to it, is India's first collective response by business and philanthropy to enable climate action. And for those of you who do not know this, we are currently hosting the climate change track at Charcha 2020. Thank you, Nudge Foundation, for hosting this beautiful event and putting us together at a time where we cannot physically be together. The COVID-19 crisis has changed the world that you and I knew in a matter of few months. This warning bell of what climate change is slowly bringing to the world. This panel will discuss the role of communications that can play in mitigating these crises and lessons learned from the current pandemic. We are lucky to be joined by a brilliant panel today, led by our moderator, Harpreet Bagga. Harpreet is a senior director and head of India operations at Purpose India, and Purpose is also a partner for this session. For those of you who do not know, Purpose has years of experience in building and supporting movements to advance the fight for an open, just, and habitable world. They have been using public mobilization and storytelling to help lead the conversations with activist business philanthropies engaged in this fight, and they have played a major role in shifting policies and change public narratives when it matters the most. With this very brief introduction, I'm going to hand it over to you, Harpreet, to begin the panel.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. As Darshi mentioned, I'm Harpreet. Very privileged and excited to be hosting and moderating this panel today with very esteemed guests that I will introduce in a few minutes. The current health and economic crisis has really changed the world in a matter of a few months. And it's really forcing us to reinvent ourselves and change the way of living and working for all of us. And I think this current scenario brings out, maybe it's just a warning bell for what climate change is slowly and how that is impacting the world slowly. So this panel is going to spend the next 50 minutes discussing how we, how we're learning from this situation and how we can rebuild ourselves to avert and mitigate further crises. So I'm hoping that we're going to have a really exciting, engaging discussion. I'm going to start it off by asking some questions to our panelists and hopefully getting everyone's creative juices going. And then I look forward to a lot of engaged Q&A. We'll keep time for that at the end, but please send in your questions as we go. I'll now ask if each of the panelists can introduce themselves. And as you introduce yourself, I'd love if you could just, explain, give your name, your organization, and then also maybe take 30 seconds to talk about what your vision is for what you would like a new normal, if I can call it that, as we get out of this crisis. So I'm going to start with, can I look over to you, Jarnail? Jarnail Singh from the MacArthur Foundation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Harpreet. Likewise, I'm really privileged and honored to be a part of this panel with the esteemed panelists. As you said, my name is Jarnail, and I've been working with the MacArthur Foundation since January this year. So ever since I joined, the world has turned upside down. So I'm not sure if it's ominous or if there's something related to the numerology of my date of joining, which was 20th of Jan 2020. So anyway, on a serious note, MacArthur Foundation has been operating in India since 1988. It's a US-based philanthropy, and we work in India on issues related to climate solutions. Ever since 1990, we have been working on issues related to population and reproductive health. And only since 2015, once Paris kicked in, that's when we thought we need to place a big bet on climate in India. And US, India, and China are three key geographies that we work on. Responding to your question on the vision or 30-second vision, I think it's a tough one, but let me just try to identify three key things that I would like to wishfully think would come true once this crisis is over, or whenever we learn to coexist with such crises in future. One is I would want to see a paradigm shift in behaviors going forward. I think people would start using hygiene seriously. taking hygiene seriously. And like we see masks, I would want to see people embracing such or adapting to such reality quickly. We had been talking about air pollution for ages now, but I think Corona has taken it to the next level, and we see everyone on the street using masks. So I think people would want to understand that prevention is better than cure, and adaptation is costlier than actually mitigation. So I think that message would be clearer, I hope, and we don't go back to the old normal. Secondly, I think I would want to see virtual become the more the new real. It feels like an oxymoron, but I think with work from home kicking in, the future of work is already here. And while we've seen two ends of the spectrum, while we were working 9 to 5 earlier, and now we're completely working from home, I think people will be much more happier if we see a mix of both, and people operating with that flexibility, integrity, and a lot more freedom at work. And the third, which I really think would change, and I really hope changes, is the future of public transport. Especially in cities like Delhi, where it's congested and it's not safe. I hope that with Corona, the new reality of public transport would be created, where it becomes hygienic. And the normal person could take it, not just the ones who are forced to take it. And I hope that a new level of hygiene is created. It becomes safer for women, especially in cities like Delhi, where social distancing might push the governments to take it seriously. So let me stop there. I think 3 trends that I've highlighted in 30 seconds, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jarnail. I look forward to building on and discussing some of these things more in our discussion. With that, can I move to Bahar to introduce herself and also give her 30-second vision? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harpreet, and delighted to be part of this conversation. My name is Bahar Dutt. I've spent a lifetime reporting on all issues related to the environment, whether it's climate change, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's mining companies flouting laws. I'd like to believe that storytelling can save the planet. And that's the reason why I'm here, because I think that I enjoy listening to stories and I enjoy telling stories. And I think that there is a lot of power in effective communication. And I think that's key. And most of the battles I find that we won today is because there was a bunch of journalists out there telling the story in an exciting way, in an exhilarating way, in a convincing way. As I said, I've done broadcast journalism, I've written 2 books, and the only institutional affiliation I have is that I like to think I'm reporting for Planet Earth, as grandiose as that sounds. But really, on a more serious note, I do believe, we're talking about effective communication, and I've seen that happen in my own lifetime, which is that you report on something and you can actually save a habitat or save an endangered species. So I think if we get our messaging right, a lot can happen. And I know these are bleak times, we're dealing with COVID-19, there are people out there who are dealing with death and hunger. And so for us to be sitting in our rooms and talking about what a post-COVID world should look like is in itself a luxury. Recognizing that we are privileged in a post-pandemic world, I'd like to see less of business as usual. I think that's how I would like to see the world. It's all very well to say, let's have blue skies. But given that, the government in its policies is continuing with business as usual, there are going to be challenges, and I'll talk about that later, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for Bahar, and I couldn't agree more of, the power of storytelling, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about that in this panel going forward. Great. With that, I'll move to Aarti Khosla. If you could introduce yourself and then give your 30-second vision, please.
Thanks, Harpreet, and thank you also for having me on the panel. My name is Aarti. I work with an international network which focuses on talking about climate change and the transition to a better world. It has a slightly longish name, but I will still say it. It's the Global Strategic Communications Council, which is part of the European Climate Foundation, which is based in Brussels. In India, I run an agency called Climate Trends, which also works at the interface of finding context for issues of global relevance to how they shape in India. I run a website also focused on climate energy issues. It's called Carbon Copy. Just in terms of how I feel the new normal, I think I'm quite non-visionary and I'm limited by my imagination. And if there is one thing that we can come out of this crisis is the fact that just if the urban middle class is able to feel the commitment for a better sustainable lifestyle, I think we've had it for a long time. I feel that the migrant crisis has revealed the fault lines that lie in our social system. And just in terms of absolute numbers and the kind of consumption that the urban middle class has been up to, even a sincere realization that things have to be slightly better will help us go a very long way. I will pause, but we'll talk of other things as we go along.
Yes, no, thank you, Aarti. And it's always helpful to have the realist, and I think short-term goals is what's going to really get us to this broader, big, a better place that we all want to get to. And with that, our fourth panelist is Anirban Koshy. If you could please introduce yourself and talk to your 30-second vision, please.
Thank you, Harpreet. Thank you for having me. I'm Anirban Koshy. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Mahindra Group. When I look at the world post-COVID, I hope, I can't call it vision, but I hope that corporations will make a greater effort to make climate-friendly solutions available, and that individuals will show greater enthusiasm for adoption of climate-friendly practices. If there is one thing to learn from this crisis, it is that we are all living beyond natural boundaries. I don't want this lesson to be lost in the rest of the noise that we have around COVID. And if there is anything that one wants to talk about in terms of communication, it is always to maintain the real lesson that this crisis has taught us. So just two things: corporations, hopefully they will make a greater effort to make climate-friendly solutions available, and individuals like you and me will make a greater effort to adopt the solutions that are available for us.
Great. Thank you for that, Anirban. And I think, again, very bold points. And if we put all those four visions together, that's a big ask for all of us individually and all the people we work with and live with, and for society at large. But I do hope that we will be able to make strides towards that. And hopefully today's discussion will try to be a bit more solution-oriented on how we can even move in that direction. So I wanted to move now to start a question that I think we're seeing a lot, hearing about a lot, and particularly like Bahar said, because we're sitting in our homes, reading the news from our windows, seeing these lovely blue skies, hearing chirping birds, to whatever extent absorbing some of the clean air to the extent we can get out in urban cities. And definitely lockdown is not the solution and the way to get to these, but it is a reminder of what human actions perhaps are doing to cause this. And so I'd love for us to actually explore what we could do differently to be able to maintain something like this while getting life back on track, if I can say. And definitely moving out. So maybe can I call on Bahar first to pick up this point, and then we'll open it up for further discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raised a valid question that, and it's ironic that there are blue skies out there. I can see it from my window right now, which was otherwise usually gray and smoggy. And but the paradox is that it's taken a tragedy for this to happen. And so, I feel very guilty celebrating a blue sky or the ability to feel happy that my asthma is not triggered these days, because of the blue skies. And yes, our environmental indices are perhaps right now at their best. We've seen, pictures of the Yamuna River very blue, and there are all kinds of indicators out there. But I think that we need to ask some tough questions as well from our policymakers and our government, because I think we're lacking a vision of the post-pandemic world, because we're so focused on, we're saying start up the economy, get it back on tracks. So it's almost like, that expressway we were hurtling ourselves down on. We don't want to question whether we need to get off that expressway. And even as you and I are speaking, the Ministry of Environment and Forests has been working overnight, to clear a number of projects, a railway line through the Western Ghats, a dam which is coming up in Northeast India on some of our most pristine forests. This happened at a time the minister held a meeting through video conferencing, the way we're doing right now on Zoom. Now, how can you assess whether a forest should be cleared or not on the basis of sitting in your rooms on a Zoom call? And that's my concern, that, we've used this time to say we need to get the economy back on track, and we're not looking at the so-called benefits which have happened of this lockdown and said, hey, how can we extend this? How can we look at clean air? We finally got clean air. Delhi has it. For so many years, so many of us on this panel have been saying we need that clean air. So how is that going to happen? And we've all been a little bit lost. And you put, millions of people indoors and voila, it happened. So if I were to ask of my policymakers, I would say, how are you going to revitalize your economy while at the same time keeping your environmental indices healthy? And my concern is, for instance, a lot of things which we were doing right before, everything wasn't wrong before. So for instance, shared transport, buses, public transport. My concern is all this is going to suffer now, because everybody's keeping in mind hygiene and social distancing, which is important. I'm not questioning that, but we're all going to want to, do away with the shared economy which we had in place. So these are my concerns right now. I want to flag those concerns, because, we can go on talking about how wonderful the blue sky is, but I know that the wheels are churning to revive the economy back to the gray skies. So I don't know, it's a question, I guess, to all the other panelists as well.
And Aarti, maybe you could,
Yeah.
Could I bring you in on that one?
Sure, and I think I totally agree with Bahar that we don't have to, put on sacrifice our environmental laws and labor laws and land laws as we try and manage COVID. There is a better way to do it. It might seem seductive right now, but that sacrifice won't take us in the long term. And I guess that is what the 1 month of lockdown has revealed. A couple of organizations, the IITs, but also others, have been using this very quiet period to actually do analysis on how much is the drop. I think the point is not to go into details of how attractive it looks when air pollution levels in Bombay drop 70% and Delhi's PM 2.5 drops 45% just by people being indoors. But I think it very clearly revealed that there is a lens that you can have to have a longer view of the problem. It's pretty clear that by just people being inside, there is no transport that is happening. There is less industry being run. There is no construction that was happening. There were no brick kilns that were running near Delhi. And all of this just in and of itself contributed to 50% reduction. And I think the point that Bahar made is pretty much there, that we are hurtling towards, a normal that we had before. The question is not of science. We've known the science for a long time, and I think the science has revealed itself yet again. The question pretty much is of political will, and do we see salience and importance in just decoupling things the way we were doing before and trying to do them differently? If we don't do them differently, I think we are landing ourselves in the same pit, and not much can be said, even on the international level. And I will just make this last point. It's quite interesting. I mean, the IPCC, which is the largest, most respected, credible climate science body, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, actually says that the world needs to reduce emissions every year by 7 to 8% reduction. This year will see 7 to 8% reduction. I think it's very clear to world leaders that you don't need 7 to 8% reduction by billions of people sitting inside. You need that reduction by making systemic structural changes. You need that reduction by better industry, by cleaner transport, by installing pollution control equipment in power plants, because you cannot just have a bottom-up approach to it unless you also have a top-down approach in which you're dealing with the large emitting sectors in the way the institutional framework needs to change. I think I'm all for the social behavior change and the need for that to happen, and that creates a good demand for what policymakers need to do. But we are pretty much at a point where the science is out there and the facts are pretty much in front of us. It's quite a matter of political will.
And maybe we can move to that point actually on how do we even rebuild ourselves? How do we work amongst ourselves as community, but also with government in rebuilding and meeting that vision that you've laid out? Jarnail, would you like to talk to that?
Sure. I think just to touch upon your previous point, and then maybe I could segue into the current one. I feel that I'd look inward, and there's a lot of things that we as climate community need to think inwardly on, and we need to do differently. One is to break the echo chamber that has been created, which is called the climate community, so to say. And I think that's where we need to reach out, go to the bottom of the pyramid, as it's said, and making sure that the messages are created right and resonate with a lot of people, with the masses, rather than just the experts or the opinion makers, and making sure that the demand is generated for cleaner solutions, as Anirban was pointing out in his vision. And I think that's where I feel effective communication could be really, really helpful. As I'm very fond of saying, skip the C word. We need not talk about the climate when communicating about climate. We could talk about a level below. Air pollution is what resonates with people of India. Things like jobs, growth. That's what is resonating, and that's why even if you go out in the open, check with the masses, they would want to turn the wheels of economy back on track, and they don't know a better way to do it. And that's why we as experts need to translate our messages into greater detail with these policymakers, making sure that we generate public support for the kind of solutions that we are projecting. And one thing which I would like to say on a recovery path that is very, very likely, not very likely, but very plausible, but not very likely in the current circumstances, is a green recovery, wherein we redefine industrial competitiveness in this day and age of post-COVID, wherein we clearly message that it's not exclusive to have environmental conservation on one hand and having economic growth on the other. Both can go hand in hand, as Bahar was saying. And there are clear stories and examples of those coming out, whether if you take the electric mobility example, for instance, that's the sector that there is political will on, there is manufacturing potential over there, there is jobs potential over there, but however, we don't see a lot of traction on the ground, while there is political will already exemplified in that scenario. Similarly, on heavy industries, they need not be the dirtiest of all as we get into the climate decade, as we used to call it, 2020 to 2030. And if you see the graph, this is the decade when the graph comes like this, if we want to hit 1.5 or 2 degrees by end of this century. And that's where I feel that there's this greater scope for international collaboration on research and development in the heavy industries bit, wherein we could redefine India's position in the world as we get into a post-COVID world, wherein Indian industries could be the greenest and also the most competitive. If you look at the cement sector, for instance, a lot of India's infrastructure needs to be built in the coming decade, and that's where I think Indian cement sector is the most efficient in the world. It's also because it started late, but I think the time is on our side, and we need to capitalize on those things. So I think industrial competitiveness and redefining it is what I would submit to the panel.
Thank you so much. And Anirban, can we bring you in on that note? And how do the vision you set out, how do you make it realistic? and tie into what Jarnail was just saying, which I think builds off that.
So Harpreet, one of the best things we can say about India is that we did not take a shortcut when it came to fighting the COVID situation. We locked down and we locked down early. Because we did not take the shortcut, we are probably going to dodge the bullet comfortably. But if, like Bahar said, we hurtle back into business as usual, perhaps in a worse way than before, we will then dive into our pot of slow poison once again, not realizing that what we are doing is going to get us into not only more COVID-like situations, but worse situations which climate change will bring about. So what should we do? I mean, there is no doubt that the economy must get going. People must, start earning money again. Jobs must happen, because that's how the whole ecosystem runs. I don't think we are in a position to rejig an ecosystem which says, okay, growth is not important. Okay, money is not important. I don't think we can do that. But there are things we can do. For example, we know that renewable energy is a huge part of the climate solution. We know it's a question of time, not if anymore. And this is an opportunity in which we can accelerate the adoption through policies and ensure that, this ulcer that we have called discoms doesn't lead us to another bigger problem where we are not adopting the solution because we've created an ulcer in the past. So this is an opportunity in which brave decisions on RE can be taken so that adoption increases quickly. Let's say that what is being said, that people will move away from public transport to personal transport because of COVID. Let's say that it does come true. Given the fact that we don't have, or we have a lot of people who can't possibly afford cars and will probably go for two-wheelers, this may be a great time to incentivize electric two-wheelers, because those are actually way more affordable compared to regular two-wheelers than electric cars are compared to regular cars. So this may be an opportunity, and I don't know whether the finance minister in her 4 or 5 messages will have anything for electric two-wheelers, but this just seems to be an opportunity. It has popped up in front of us. We can make the most of it. We've seen how clean water has returned to the Yamuna. I mean, this is not a minor miracle. This in all ways is a major miracle. I have lived on the banks of the Yamuna for 7 years at Mayur Vihar in Delhi in the later part of the previous century. The Yamuna wasn't that bad then, but then it's become awful. I mean, you can barely call it a river. In every city in the country, we've got what has been a river gradually become a nala, to become a sewage canal, to become something nobody even knew was a river before. But right now, we can see that just a 1-month hiatus can bring clean water into something as large as the Yamuna River. What then would we require to ensure that effluent treatment plants get accelerated and adopted, and that we ensure that we don't put our muck into water bodies, which we've been doing for centuries, but we are doing it at such a scale now that we are completely ruining the ecosystem. And lastly, construction is going to be an important thing to get the economy back on track. Here's another opportunity that's sitting in front of us. We can enable and incentivize green construction, because we know that green construction not only requires lesser energy and lesser resources, but it ensures the consumption of lesser energy in the future. Apparently 70% of the buildings we'll need in India in 2050 are not built yet. Here's an opportunity that's fallen into our laps to try and incentivize the building of green buildings, move towards net zero buildings, and ensure that the emissions and the pollution that we cause will be lesser in the future. So there are opportunities sitting in front of us. There are solutions that are available which we can incentivize. Let's not even talk about the solutions which will come in the future. But we have an opportunity now, and it would be great to be able to push these forward because we understand the value of that now much more than we did 1 month ago.
And thank you very much for that. I think that's a very tangible and specific way of solutions that we could work towards, that I think all of us, at least I'm guessing, are sort of coming to the realization of how important they are. But I'm wondering, how can we build on that piece so that actually some of this realization that all of us are developing converts into action? In communication parlance, in the way we use it, how do we activate or mobilize the public at large, or specific elements? I know that Aarti spoke about the upper middle class maybe, but how do we actually try to make action of this? How do we engage in different ways with us as a community? How we sort of advocate with government, policymakers will listen to, you know, what the public is saying, corporate industry will respond to how consumers are behaving. So I'd love for us, as we're, professionals working in this, especially in this communication space, how can we change some of that thinking, that behavior change, and really activate and mobilize? Bahar.
So yeah, I actually, it takes off from what Anirban was saying as well, and without sounding very bleak, as I said, that there are in fact some cities around the world who are taking this as an opportunity. The mayor of Paris is looking at how can they just take out all the cars from the center of the city and have more cycling tracks. Now, of course, I can't compare the city of Delhi to the city of Paris. Again, huge difference there. But I'm saying that there are cues we can take from other policy makers where they've decided this is the time to pause, look back and think, where are we going wrong and how do we change it? And I think that, city leaders across the world are trying to do that. And I think this is the time maybe to rethink our cities. Do we need that many cars on the road? Can we redesign our cities in a different and more exciting way? And I was just looking at some of the questions which have come in, and Aditi she raised a question on, but how do we make people choose the less convenient option? And in fact, that's the whole problem, because we haven't built in green into our economy, because we haven't integrated it into the way things are supposed to be. We see it as a morally righteous thing we're supposed to do, which will cause us inconvenience. And to me, a classic example of providing the right nudge effect for that to happen is, and speaking of communication, is the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. I mean, the government made it very clear that it is politically committed to Swachh Bharat. It provided the right, media for that. It provided the right infrastructure, whether it was through the creation of toilets, and it made, it made socially appropriate behavior as easy to do. So likewise with the environment, people, if you make public transport easy and accessible, and if you make it as you provide that last mile connectivity, then yes, the upper middle class, who it takes pride in its 7 cars, but is happy to take public transport when they go abroad. Why should they not do the same in our cities? It's just that we need to design it better, especially for women who are worried about safety issues, and therefore will, be more inclined to take a car as opposed to transport. So I think nudging in the right direction, integrating it into our economy and not seeing it as external, I think these are 2 or 3 steps which could make this a reality.
Very true. And I think figuring out how to do that nudging is going to be a key task for many of us. Anirban, I'll let you respond to that. And then I want to ask one more question, and then we can open to the broader Q&A.
Harpreet, these days it seems those videos on TikTok and fake news videos do more nudging than they should. But it just shows that they're effective. So if we have to adopt a medium to nudge people in the right direction, maybe that's the way to do it, to put the right information out in that form. which is, not preachy, which is enjoyable, but which talks about the right thing. And this is probably the right time. I mean, today you don't have to explain to people about the dangers that are likely or that can happen. One of the difficult conversations in any climate conversation was, oh, so how likely is it? Oh, maybe it'll happen later, maybe it won't happen. But you don't have to explain that anymore. So, so as Bahar is saying, I'm just wondering, why not adopt the same techniques that chaps use in TikTok and, various other videos of that kind?
That's a very important point, and at least I think, especially with the current scenario, we're all being pushed to use digital means, and we at Purpose are actually exploring so many of those platforms to reach out. So TikTok, share chat, in addition to WhatsApp, YouTube, and Twitter and Instagram, of course, are all ways of reaching, and how video content, in addition to written content, are so important to be able to reach out and, get us thinking and hopefully convert us to action, and how you can actually create digital communities or communities of practice that can actually together mobilize and create change. Jarnail.
Yes, I would just like to add an element of language and humor to it. How many of us actually communicate in Hindi or any local language on our Twitter handles? Not many, very few. And we don't have such influential Twitter handles coming up from tier 2 or tier 3 cities or even rural areas. So I think we need to redefine who is the influencer in this case, whether it's people sitting in Delhi who are just chatting in English and making sure that we serve each other with the jargon, or we are really reaching out to the communities. And I think that's where we'll be able to communicate well to the masses, the migrant workers, as we call them. They're not really the migrant workers. They are the the wheels of, or the engine of our economy, as we see right now. If it's in a lockdown, it's because of the brakes that we have applied over there. And I think on the humor side, I think humor is missing completely from this community, and Anirban does bring a sense of it, and we all try to be humorous. But I think this lockdown has enabled us to get a human touch to it, and humor derives it from human. And I feel that when I'm working from home and I don't feel like my son coming into the frame really disturbs the conversation, it becomes more human. And I think with that human touch and adding a tinge of humor really gets connected from it helps us connect from one human to other. And I think that's where I have high expectations from organizations like Purpose, who are using these digital means, especially TikTok and others. And I think we need to be early in that thing, because otherwise fake news and everything else is taking up our minds. And, not just the tier 1 city mind, but the whole India's mind space as such.
Thank you, Jarnail. And that leads beautifully into the next question, my last question before we move to the broader Q&A. That this crisis has actually highlighted the vulnerabilities in our society. You just spoke about migrant workers, daily wage workers, women actually, or youth who are really suffering through these times. And these are all vulnerable groups who I think are probably bearing the worst brunt of the current scenario, likely to be the most impacted as we see more change, impact from even the climate crisis. And I wanted to talk about this with the panel, and how do we work with them to help in this rebuilding? And can we make maybe them champions for climate action? And that's a very large part of the population. Yes, they're not English speaking and not listening to Zoom conversations like this, where we are talking about what needs to be done, but they're a huge base. We've seen how the economy and the country has to create provisions and support for them. And even as we move down the economic recovery, there can be a critical part of it. So how do we take them along, help them be champions of this? I'd like to open that up to any.
Can I share some thoughts on this?
Yeah.
I think first of all, it's important that we have some candidness in our conversation. It's important to make the vulnerables, the champions, but some of us who have followed the international climate debate, and sorry if that's not a very good example, but clearly shows, you know, the vulnerabilities of the vulnerable, so to say. It's always a certain group which assumes more importance, and you know, there the conversations are totally different because it's developed countries versus the developing and the least developing. But I think pretty much the same dynamics works everywhere. What is important is that as big muscular things like the economic stimulus package and all these attractive big investment announcements happen, just to be making sure that the rural economy is also sustained. People who have gone back to villages will come back in, you know, for their livelihoods in a couple of months. But is there any way to make sure that there are new kind of jobs that they are able to do? Prime Minister's speech spoke a lot about local. I mean, local does not mean Swadeshi alone. It also means hyperlocal produce. It means relooking at the supply chains. Possibly it also means just new kinds of agriculture, more productive agriculture in the local areas. Are these the kind of things that we could do just to make sure that whoever we call our migrants are no longer migrants, but are living in their native places and contributing to the economy more productively? Of course, you know, it seems like a long shot if we don't do it well and if we just scratch the surface, but it also is a possible thing, because that is where, you know, the real assets will lie. Ultimately, it will be about just giving livelihood opportunities to people where they are. And a very often used term in the energy circles is decentralization. You know, you put a rooftop plant, solar panel on your terrace, and you don't need the ulcers of Discom, like Anirban said, to be supplying power to you. But I think that holds true in a lot of cases. Just decentralizing the economy in a way that there are pockets of excellence, which are even if isolated, but that will go a long way, rather than taking a very bird's eye view of what really needs to be done and immediately exploring how do you make champions out of people who really are living by the day, don't have, you know, the next meal. And I think the kind of images that have come from across the country have shaken the world, and not just India, to say the least. So there is lots of work that needs to be done there. But I also saw on the chat there were comments, and I think Dharani made that comment on how do you make sure that it is not just about social behavior change with the urban middle class, but you make systemic and institutional changes. And I guess that's what that point is about, that you really boost things that need to be boosted, and then it is not about looking at things in silo. It's got nothing to do with climate change. It's just got to do with having a resilient health system, about giving people education, about giving some kind of opportunities. And then even if you don't say climate change, I think you have delivered on climate change. And we are living in a world where whether or not climate action happens is irrespective. If you can come out of the current situation wiser, that itself will mean climate action. If you don't come out wiser, either there will be no climate action or there will be just climate action on paper. And I think people like us who communicate on climate change have to be pretty much clear of this two-way street, that, you know, it's not the COVID crisis will end and the climate crisis will begin. Things are happening in parallel, and that is what the world is today. I will pause.
Thank you. Anirban.
So let me build on that a little. So, you know, there is a paradigm that us fellows who work in climate and sustainability believe in. We think that, okay, you make people aware and then they will go forward and do the right thing and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with that. It'll happen with some people. But the very large majority of the people, that's not how change will come. Because that's not how change comes in almost any scenario. So if you want people to do the right thing going forward, we have to make the solutions obvious to them. So, you know, if tomorrow renewable energy is supplied by your distribution company, you're not going to say, I don't want it. You will adopt it. And if renewable energy is available to corporations today, and as luck would have it, they are a little bit cheaper, they'll all take it, whether they understand climate or not. So the large part of the climate solution is about making systemic changes and making solutions available so that those solutions are actually better than the solutions that you and I have today. And that's the real challenge. I'll take a short while on the migrant worker situation. I just want to say one thing. that usually when we are talking about migrant workers, we talk about suffering, we talk about food, we talk about shelter, we talk about government. But the more I dig deeper into this, I find it's only a conversation on dignity. There are loads of people who are walking back home today who were in a space that was safe and who had food to eat, but have still chosen to go back because there was no work and there was no money and they didn't want freebies all the time. So the story of dignity is actually a very big story in society. It's not only for migrant workers, it's for farmers as well. You want them to do the right thing, give them a sense of dignity, recognize what they do, and suddenly you find they're adopting much better farming practices than they were doing before. I've spent almost 2 decades in agriculture and I've seen this every day while I've worked with farmers. The same story exists with small businessmen around the country. They say business to hai, lekin respect kidhar hai? And if there is a way in which you can give dignity to people, they will do the right thing for you. And I think the big underlying untalked about issue in this whole migrant worker crisis is the lack of dignity that they enjoy in the places that they work and stay and eat.
Thank you. Thank you. Very valid points. Would anyone like to build on that? Otherwise, I can move to looking at the Q&A and see how we can. Great. So I'm going to move to Mona's question. There are a lot of learnings and achievements in India in the climate change space. However, there is not enough knowledge shared locally and globally. What are some of the significant challenges for this issue? What is the standard of communication, material knowledge, and collaborations? Anyone?
Could I go first on that?
Yes, please.
I think that's a very good question, Mona. Thank you for that. I think a lot of our content that we generate from the climate space, especially in India, is static. And I think that's where it needs to be more dynamic. You know, everyone watches a Mashable video or a Vox, documentary or anything that they do on how stuff works. But unfortunately, we do not have resources and capacity, or probably we do not prioritize doing that level of deciphering on whatever we publish. We are in the grant making space right now. We have deployed almost 60 grants in the past 4.5 years. And I was reviewing the portfolio just now, and we have seen very little dynamic content coming out of it in terms of public awareness, making sure that people move from awareness to action. And I think that's the gradient that we need to chart. And there has to be some specific philanthropic efforts on making sure that knowledge that we create through grants to think tanks and research organizations doesn't just sit there or doesn't just reach the policymakers table, but also gets communicated widely and simply and evocatively to the people that matter. In addition, I feel that there has to be a platform which kind of summarizes this whole thing, but not really a standard platform that we see like a portal or a website. But what Anirban was saying, more TikTok handles coming out, and that's where I think we need to redefine communications in the climate space.
Thank you. And I think that might lead well into Rama Kumaraswamy's question. How can climate experts communicate better? What can be done to improve climate change communication? It is intangible per se. The jargon goes overhead for people not in the space, and folks struggling to meet their day-to-day expenses. It's hardly a pressing concern. I know that we've alluded to this a bit already on how climate change communication really doesn't necessarily need to be climate change. And I think that's perhaps one of the key lessons we're also learning out of today's time, right? And how I think Aarti spoke about that, but when we're going back to a resilient economy, or we take that path, then we are working towards climate action. But wondered if anybody else would like to add to that.
I could attempt an answer, and it also ties into some of the other questions that were raised about, how climate communications, for instance, happens in the developed world and in the developing world. And there was actually a study done collating all the media stories that are done, whether in the West or in developing or emerging economies. And there was a very interesting difference that they found. What they found was that in the US, it's more political. So it will be related more to, are you a climate skeptic or are you a climate believer? And whereas in the emerging economies, the communication tended to focus on impacts. So it would be, okay, a storm has happened, that it has impacted livelihoods. Or if we switch to a renewable economy, then what will be the impacts on people? So I found that as an interesting sort of difference in the way we report, depending on which part of the world we are in. Regarding climate change communications, I think what we lack as communicators, and I've been saying it even in air pollution debates as well, and to many of my colleagues who work on air pollution, that we lack a solutions orientation. We're very good at pointing out what the problems are, and this is something which government and policy makers also constantly complain about to activists as well, that we don't offer solutions. So we're very good at saying this is not right, this is not working well, the government hasn't implemented this well, but the solutions orientation, or what is it that we want that world to be? You asked that question, in fact, in the beginning, that what is our vision for that world? Is it just a utopia which we think we'll never reach? So for instance, in some of the articles which I've been doing over the past 2-3 years, I've tried to now focus on, okay, thermal power plants are not working. Okay, somebody's violating a law here. But I think, for instance, I've been focusing on who are the air pollution champions. There was a bunch of citizens who go out there and who champion the cause of air pollution, who've actually made a difference. So I think it's time to tell those stories. And again, perhaps use the TikToks and different media beyond Twitter, the regional languages, to tell those stories. So a solutions orientation, I think, is a must.
Could I quickly add to that, Bahar? I think this is something that I've learned from my 4-year-old toddler. If I tell him not to do something, he'll keep on doing that thing. But if I distract him, and if I get him an alternate vision, that creates action.
Exactly.
And this is proven science also in human psychology, that if you communicate about doom, that's going to lead to paralysis. People would just think, oh, I can't do anything. While if you communicate about an imaginative future or a shared vision, that's when they get into action. And I think TED Talks do a great job in painting an alternative future. Our Prime Minister does an amazing job in painting that future. And I think we need to learn from that and as a climate community before it's too late.
Thank you. There's one, I'm sorry that I don't think we're going to be able to get through all the questions, and trying to catch them all while we're on this Zoom call is not the easiest. The one I see in front of me is, would it make sense to have a collaboration group amongst civil society organizations in India to force a case of a climate-friendly economy with the government with the right solutions? Would love to hear the panel's views.
Maybe I can go on, Anirban.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying that, the last couple of years, at least the last 5 years, I have seen that there is far more collaboration than there was in the previous years, both as the air quality crisis has worsened and NGOs, think tanks, academics have tried to come together and talk in one voice. I know that traditionally it has been quite a contentious issue, and the one voice is tenuous, especially when we are talking of India's position on climate change in the international arena and so forth, and it becomes a different argument altogether. But I take the point that there is value in joining up what we have to say, and at least to the Indian government, because ultimately it is coming down to the same thing. So the short answer is yes, it's happening, but the ecosystem is so large and the need is so big that a lot more needs to happen.
So, when we go to watch cricket, we put up signs saying, give me a 6 or give me a 4 or something like that. What would it take to get 1 million people put up a sign say, give me renewable energy? Yeah. So what if there is a purpose campaign in Delhi, all around Lutyens, wherever it matters, with people holding a sign, give me RE? Or is it ridiculous?
No, I think ultimately we have to, we all need to get together to create change. It's very easy to blame others, right? Sometimes we'll blame the policymakers, sometimes we blame corporates, we'll blame the others, that others aren't taking action. but how many of us are able to convert our talk into action? How are we able to rally others along with things that we believe strongly in, I think is going to be the core. And I think, just as you said, Anirban, it is about getting that scale of that want and the demand and backing a particular solution that all of us want, rather than aligning on the problem. If we align on the solutions that we all want to collectively ask for. And for that, I think we need to find interesting ways for us to collect and mobilize around common issues. And I think climate change is such a big beast, if I can call it, so large that it becomes hard for us to find alignment. But if we are able to narrow it down and then build the kind of people who are most engaged on that particular topic. And in India, we have numbers of particular communities. It's about us getting together to do that. And I think we will spur things into action. And I don't think it's an impossible vision. I think it's something that all of us need to work much closer together on. And as Aarti said, I think even from our experience, collaboration is recognized, I think, more broadly now that is the way forward. Each of us individually cannot do as much as us collectively. And on that note, I'm going to have to call this panel to a close. We've quickly got to 1:57. I don't really know how time flew by, but I do take away from this on how all of us need to work towards converting this talk into action that's going to take us towards a more resilient economy, a more green economy, take those brave decisions and those brave actions, and not feel that it's not climate action or it's not climate change. Whichever bit resonates with us. We want we want electric vehicles because that's an easier mode of transport, and it works because that's just a better way to do our private transport, or we use public transport, or the buildings that we're creating, we create buildings for the future. And so if we talk about topics more like that, I think maybe we get more traction and we move to the economy and we rebuild, but we rebuild back better, stronger, and really strengthen where India's positioning is in all of this. And I think each of us, I think it has definitely brought out that the way that we communicate and the way that we all get together probably has a very crucial part in making this happen. Would anyone else like to make any closing comments in the 1 minute that we have? Great, so thank you very much to Nudge for organizing this, for India Climate Collaborative for helping put this together, and last but not least, all the panelists for taking out the time to be so actively engaged in the conversation.